In previous modules, we've talked about what is a web server, how does it send data to the web browser. We've talked about how we organize our projects and things like that. Now we're going to start to talk about how do we actually build the web page. And this is going to be a real quick module because there's just a couple of important key pieces of information I want to talk about. So the first is, how is a web page actually created? And we've talked a lot about other things about the web, and we've never talked about how do we actually create it. So the first thing we need to know is that a web page is just a plain text file. Now, I mentioned this earlier, and I said that when the server sends information to a browser, it encodes it as text/HTML. And what that means is a text file, but the browser knows, hey, this is an HTML file, and I should now display it using my HTML render engine. That's done on the server side. The text part is done on our side, where we're going to use a text file to create it. So if you're on Windows, you can use something like Notepad or Notepad++ to be able to create an HTML document. In fact, I've done this in many cases before. On a Mac, you might use something like text. On Linux, you might use something like Jot or even Vim if you're kind of a sadist. If you don't know what Vim is, you probably don't want to find out. It's very complicated and most people hate it, but that's a different story. What I'm going to be using throughout this course is Visual Studio Code. Now, Visual Studio Code is a simpler version of Visual Studio. It doesn't have all of its features, but it still has a large number of features and even some features that some people prefer over Visual Studio. Additionally, it's free and it's available on both Macintosh and Windows. So it has a lot of really good features as far as that goes, as far as cross-platform compatibility. So this is Visual Studio Code, and as I mentioned, I like to keep my stuff organized. So I'm going to go up here to File and choose Open Folder. So I've created a folder for where I'm going to put all this stuff. Now you see that this is just one of my default folders. I have one for doing all my courses where I call Source Code. It's just under my C drive. I then have one called HTML, and then I can create one for my individual modules if I want to. If I want to create a new project, I can simply click on New Folder, type in a project name, and then I can go into that folder. Once I've done, I want to select this folder. I just click on Select Folder. You notice the screen will kind of flash as it opens up a little change. You notice over here on the far left-hand side, I have my open editors, I have my folder for my project, and any files listed in it are going to be here. If I want to create a new file, I can simply create a new file here. I'm going to choose a text file. HTML is not listed, but I can come here and click Select a Language. I can start to type in HTML, and it should come up. I'm going to save this real quick just as sample1.htm, and I have an HTML document. Now, right now you don't see anything, and that's an important note. It creates a completely blank document for you. We'll talk about how we can set up templates and things like that in a future module. Right now, I just want to show you a couple of quick things. Now, before I get much further, a lot of times people ask me, well, can I use something like Google Docs or maybe Microsoft Word, which I have access to? You know, they have the ability to export as an HTML document. And you know what? You are correct. You can export as an HTML document. However, my experience is that this is usually a poor option. Now, I say usually because every once in a while, if you're just needing to put something out as an HTML document that other people can see, you want to do it quickly, it works. But trying to organize and format your information, creating links to other files, be able to have optimized source code, none of these things are allowed or really capable inside of a visual editor like Microsoft Word, Write, or Google Docs, or anything else along those lines. I've created a Microsoft Word document and export out as HTML, and then I've gone in and recreated that same document in HTML myself. And what I typically find is that the document that was created by a tool like Microsoft Word is much, much larger. sometimes 30, 40 kilobytes larger. And when you're talking about a file that should only be 2 or 3 kilobytes, finding something that's 15 to 20 times larger, well, how many of you like to wait on a web page to download? Exactly. It's just a lot more complicated. There's a lot of rules, and it's trying to make it so that the web page looks more like the Microsoft Word document or whatever your source material is, and that can cause issues. Now, there are some tools that are visual editors. They sometimes call it WYSIWYG. What you see is what you get. And they are designed to create HTML documents. And they do a much better job, but I've even found them to be somewhat limiting in certain aspects, especially if you really understand HTML5 and know how to use its organizational structures. So we're going to focus on a tag editor such as Visual Studio Code. Now, the next thing that people ask is, when you start creating this, I notice that you indent a lot. And yes, I do. This sometimes rises to the question of days of old, is white space your friend or your foe? Now, white space is going to be things like spaces, tabs, carriage returns, those types of things. Things that you don't see, but you can kind of sometimes see the effect of them as they move your tags around. Well, HTML ignores white space. It says, you've got a white space, I'm going to put one space here, and then I'm going to ignore anything after it. So it shows you one white space, and this allows you to have spaces between words. But if you put word, space, 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 word, you're only going to see one space. So you might say, okay, well, why would I want to put white spaces in? Well, as you'll see when I'm starting to write things out, I like to indent things and put things on new lines to make it organized. Now, does this make my file larger? Yes, it does. Does it make it so much larger it's going to slow down my website? Probably not. And this is for two reasons. The number of white spaces that get added is relatively small compared to the size of my content. The second part is that almost every web server now has automatic compression enabled. What does that mean? Well, imagine sending a file to a friend, and it's a large file. It's 1 or 2 megabytes in size. How long is that going to take to send? Well, it's going to be too big. Maybe it won't fit inside your email because your email has a limitation. And so instead you decide, hey, I'm going to compress this file. I'm going to put it into a zipped file or a compressed folder in modern parlance on Windows. Well, if you do that, now your file is much smaller, and it took out all those redundancies that said, oh, I noticed that you have this pattern. And so instead of taking 7, 8, 10 bytes, it takes up 2. One to say how many, what space is going to be shown and how many times it's going to repeat. Just as a very overly simplified example. Well, your web server does this automatically. So by being able to compress those files, it makes the files smaller, and therefore you don't have to worry about what that space is. In a web page, you're going to see everything is created inside of tags. And I mentioned this just a minute ago. Well, a tag is anything that's inside of brackets. And you'll notice that Visual Studio Code gives us a list like, oh, here's a list of all the tags that you might want to have. Well, I'm just going to create some simple examples. These aren't real tags, but just kind of give you an idea of what they might look like. So I have a tag, and you can see it like this. Visual Studio Code is nice enough to know that, hey, it's going to need a closing tag, and that's exactly correct. So Visual Studio Code does a great job in helping us. It's one of the reasons I like using it over something like a plain text editor like Notepad or Notepad++. You'll also notice that it does color highlighting. And this lets us know that, hey, here's a color, I recognize this, and you will start to learn to see, oh, this color is associated with a tag. And you can see it like that. Now, I can have nested tags, and nesting of tags is very important. So I can have an outer tag, and I can have a inner. And notice that my closing inner needs to be before my closing outer. This is very important. I can't have open tag 1, open tag 2, close tag 1, close tag 2. I always have to close my inner tag, and then I can close my outer tag. Now, another thing I'll do, and it depends upon what tags I'm using and why I'm using it, is I will often take my tag and make it something like this. Remember I said how I like to indent things. This is a perfect example of it. If I have an outer tag and I have an inner tag, I often like to indent my inner tag, especially if it's an organizational tag. And we're going to talk about different types of tags in just a minute, but here you can kind of see how that indentation would work. Why I do this is it makes it easier for me to see where does things start and where do things end, and I can group and organize things. This is all part of making it easier for me to work with. The browser's not going to care. It's going to display based upon other rules, and we'll talk about those rules in the future, but this makes it much easier for me. So while tags are the important thing for displaying HTML pages, you also have attributes, and attributes allow you to modify slightly an HTML tag. So there's an image tag, and it's img, and it has an attribute to know where's the source of this image. Well, it's src, and it gets a value. And so it says equals, and you notice that it's in quotes. Visual Studio Code went ahead and put those quotes there for me, and I can say myimage.jpg as an example. So attributes will sometimes take a value, and if so, it's the attribute name equals, and then a file name. Imagine if you had to have a new tag for every possible file name for every possible image you might have. You could never do it. It'd be too complex. Attributes allow you to further define those tags. Almost every HTML tag has some attributes that you can use with it. Now, some tags just have a couple of potential attributes. Other tags you'll see have potentially dozens of attributes. And that's real important to know what attributes are associated with what tags. And as we go through different tags, we will see what those attributes are. Now, sometimes we're going to have a tag like option, and we can specify a Boolean attribute. And that just means that either the attribute's set or it's not. And selected is a great example of this. If I have a group of options, I can say selected. And selected just says, if I see this attribute, I know I'm selected. I don't have to say selected equals true. I don't have to say selected equals selected. I just say selected. And it simplifies this. In older versions of HTML, we had to say selected equals, and they say, you know what? Why are we doing this? It's a Boolean value. It's yes or no. Let's just say selected. So notice there is no equals, there's no quotes. Okay, and it's still completely correct. Now, as we start building out our web page, we have our tags, we have our attributes. We'll need to know that our tags are going to fall into two major categories, and there will be a couple of subcategories. So the first major category you're going to find is either block level tags or inline tags. And a block level tag is kind of as you might think in what I said, is it creates blocks. And at the beginning and end of that block, it will be on new lines. So if you have a block tag and then have another block tag, for example, like a paragraph, your paragraph doesn't start off immediately after that last word. It goes down to a new line. And that's what a block level tag does. In fact, a paragraph is a type of block level tag. We will talk all about these different types of tags, and as we introduce these tags, we'll tell you if they're block level or the other option, which is inline. Inline tags are kind of what inline sounds like. They're right in line with that set of text or that content. So we're not going to go out and create a new block. We're not going to move down a new line. It's going to keep right on moving. For example, a link. When we create a link to another web page, you don't see the link on another line. It's right there in the middle of that paragraph, or maybe it's an image and it's off to the side, or wherever it might be. So links are a great example of an inline tag. Now in the block level tag, we have two subcategories. We have content, like the paragraph. And paragraphs allow us to put in content that is visible to the end user. We also have what's known as organizational tags. And organizational tags are used to help us organize, hence the term, the way our web page is laid out. This makes it maybe easier to put blocks of our web page in certain areas, for example, like a sidebar. Or it might allow us to group and organize information to make it easier for a web browser to determine how to display it, a search engine to know how to read it, and know what parts are important. Organizational tags will also be very important for allowing us to style the web page. And styling the web page means that we get a chance to change the way it looks. You see, every tag in HTML has a default style. That is, I can write out plain HTML and it's going to show up on my screen in my browser in a certain way. Now, what is that way? Well, I don't know. I can't tell you without knowing what those tags are that you used. But it's going to be pretty boring. It's going to be mostly black and white text, and it probably is not going to look real nice. Therefore, we're going to use cascading style sheets in order to change the way it looks. And so that's an important thing to know and keep in mind, is that's real important to displaying our web page. Those organizational tags make it easier for us to use CSS or cascading style sheets to change the way a web page looks, to improve it, to make it more visually appealing. Just like we talked about, you always want to be looking for when you're thinking about your audience and you're doing website reviews. We've talked about those in previous modules if you need to go back and review them. All right, so now we kind of have a basic idea of how web pages are created with tags and attributes and things like that. Our next module, we're going to start looking at how do we actually build a basic web page.